I'm glad this is audio only.
This episode is sponsored by Hired.com. Every week on Hired, they run an auction where over 1,000 tech companies in San Francisco, New York, and LA bid on JavaScript developers, providing them with the salary and equity up front. The average JavaScript developer gets an average of 5 to 15 introductory offers and an average salary of over $130,000 a year. Users can either accept an offer and go right into interviewing with the company or deny them without any continuing obligations. It's totally free for users, and when you're hired, they also give you a $2,000 signing bonus as a thank you for using them. But if you use the Adventures in Angular link, you'll get a $4,000 bonus instead. Finally, if you're not looking for a job but know someone who is, you can refer them to Hired to get a $1,337 bonus if they accept a job. Go sign up at hired.com/adventuresinangular. Does your team need to master AngularJS? Oasis Digital offers Angular Bootcamp, a 3-day in-person workshop class for individuals or teams. Bring us to your site or send developers to ours, angularbootcamp.com. This episode is sponsored by Wijmo5, a brand new generation of JavaScript controls. A pretty amazing line of HTML5 and JavaScript products for enterprise application development in that Wijmo5 leverages ECMAScript 5, and each control ships with AngularJS directives. Check out the faster, lighter, and more mobile Wijmo 5. This episode is sponsored by DigitalOcean. DigitalOcean is the provider I use to host all of my creations. All the shows are hosted there, along with any other projects I come up with. Their user interface is simple and easy to use, their support is excellent, and their VPSs are backed on solid-state drives and are fast and responsive. Check them out at DigitalOcean.com. If you use the code AngularAdventures, you'll get a $10 credit. Hey everybody, and welcome to episode 52 of the Adventures in Angular podcast. This week on our panel we have Lucas Rubelkey.
Hello.
Joe Eames.
Hey everybody.
Ward Bell.
Hello, hello.
I'm Charles Max Wood from devchat.tv. Before we introduce our guest, I have a couple of quick announcements. One is I just launched Rails Clips, which is a video series about Ruby on Rails. Half of the episodes will be free, the other half will be subscription, so you can go check those out right now. I have a few episodes up, and there will be more every week. The second announcement is that I put up the talks for JS Remote Conf. I'm putting one out every week on its own RSS feed, and you can go check that out at remoteconfs with an F or with an S at the end, .com. And finally, I'm looking for companies that need help getting started or getting traction with testing. So if you know a company that uses Ruby on Rails and is struggling with testing, let me know. I'm looking for opportunities where I can actually come in person and help them out. Our guest this week is Jack Doyle.
Hey guys, it's an honor to be here.
You want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Jack Doyle with GreenSock, and basically GreenSock makes tools that are for animating the web. So we kind of have a background in Flash, and I'm sure on this show that's probably like a boo moment if you can cue up the soundtrack, right? No, but it actually was a great learning experience, and I like Flash a lot. But these days we've pretty much completely moved over to the open web and HTML5 and JavaScript and CSS, and loving it. So GreenSock, we've made the suite of tools that hopefully makes your job easier when it comes to animating the web.
So this library used to be a Flash library and is now a JavaScript library? Exactly,
yeah. I mean, technically we have both currently. So there's an ActionScript version and a JavaScript version. But of course, the JavaScript version is really where all the action is these days.
I also want to clarify before we get started. I'm sure somebody's going to say GSAP or GSAP. That is GreenSock's animation platform.
Exactly. Yep.
So we're talking about the same thing.
I just want to know where the word green sock comes from. Why not red sock or blue sock?
Oh gosh, that takes me back to it's every time I tell this story, it's like slightly different. And I always forget little details. But no, it basically comes down to, when I started the company, it was way back when, dinosaurs were roaming the earth and the internet was kind of beginning. And, we were helping clients to take a step into, engaging the web, but we don't actually take the step for them, but we make it a lot more warm and cozy. So we're more like a sock. We're not like a leg or a foot where we take the step for the client, where we made it easier for them and more comfortable. So, and green's the color of growth and prosperity and that kind of fun stuff. So that's the short version of the story.
I get it. It's very meta.
I just had a Zen moment.
Let me just meditate on that for a moment. So I've been using GreenSock for years. I think, yes, since dinosaurs were roaming the earth. Could you give us kind of the condensed version of how GreenSock just came to be? And then just a little bit of commentary on the challenges of porting that from ActionScript to JavaScript.
Sure. Yeah. Well, my background's all in design, believe it or not. I didn't take a single computer science class or anything like that. Worked at an ad agency. And so I'm going to fast forward through a lot of years of doing print-based stuff. But then, the internet happened. And so then I started working with some bigger agencies doing banner ads and that kind of thing. And there were no tools that I could find that would do what I needed them to do. When you're dealing with banner ads, and I don't think anybody really likes banner ads, but they really drive a lot of the web. And there are very strict file size requirements. And of course, performance is really important as well. So I just kind of created this thing called Tween Lite back in the day. And, for my own projects for the ad agency I was working for. And, I figured, hey, maybe there are some other people out there that could use it. So I kind of tossed it out there on the web on just a terrible looking blog-ish site. And it started to get traction. And, people started using it and liking it. And then they would request features and I'd bake them in and then put it out there. And it just kind of got a lot of traction. And then, there came a point where there were so many people using it and, there were business critical applications kind of depending on it. And, it was taking more and more of my time. And so I kind of had to figure out, how am I going to do this? And am I going to work at the ad agency? Is that my primary thing? And then I just kind of do this on the side. And if that's the case, then I only have a certain number of hours in the day that I can devote to this. And so, I've seen a lot of open source projects out there that kind of stagnate and die because the very thing that kills them can actually be their success, because there are so many people that then start depending on it and asking for new features and that kind of stuff that the author gets overwhelmed. And it's like, I've got my day job and then I got this thing and it's growing into this big monster that I don't have time to maintain. And so it gets stressful. And so I didn't want to really go down that path. And I figured there was a fork in the road, and I figured I got to figure out a way to make this a win-win. And, I don't want to leave my users out there hanging. And so, I created GreenSock, and you didn't really ask about the club stuff or the licensing stuff, so I don't want to get too far into that, but that's kind of where it came from, and trying to make something that was protected from, or at least my attempt at protecting it from some of the common killers of open source stuff. So I kind of took a step away from the ad agency and started doing this stuff full time. And an animation engine is a bit of a unique beast in the open source world, because it's not, in a way, it's a one trick pony, but it's not really, because there are so many things that you can animate, and there's so many moving targets and features and things that people want, that it's not just a really a one-off thing that you can put out there and everybody uses it, and it's just, you don't really need to maintain it very much. There have been many years of research and kind of fine-tuning this thing and listening to customers and hanging out in the forums and hearing what they want and trying to build that into the tool set, while at the same time keeping it really fast and really lean. So that's basically where GreenSock was born, was this animation thing that I built for myself, and just kind of became something a lot of other people wanted to use, and I kept building it up.
So I'm wondering a little bit, we have animations, or transforms anyway, in CSS. Did that put a dent in your business at all, or does this go like way beyond that?
First of all, we had the Flash thing first.
Right.
And we didn't do anything with JavaScript for a long time. So transitions and CSS animations kind of pre-existed. When we jumped over to the JavaScript side of things, they were there already. In fact, I was kind of excited. I read all these articles about how fast they were. and, being native in the browser and kind of leveraging the power and speed of those was something that I definitely wanted to use to actually build GreenSock on top of. And so that was the first thing I tried to do, in fact. So it wasn't necessarily a competing thing. There were a lot of things in transitions and CSS animations that you couldn't really do. So I figured GreenSock could supplement that and kind of build on top of it. But I ran into a lot of problems with that. And so I quickly discovered that that was pretty much impossible for me to have the kind of features that our audience really needs, build that on top of CSS transitions and animations. And so that's why we kind of went the full-on JavaScript direction.
Yeah. One other thing that I want to ask about before we get into like how it works is who is it really aimed at? Like, who are the people that are going to look at GreenSock and go, oh, I need this, as opposed to people who are going to go, oh, that's interesting, another animation library?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there are really two types of users out there that I've seen. There are those that are doing kind of UI animation where it's simple, make the button glow or wiggle or, click on something and it slides over maybe. And that's the extent of what they're doing. And I think those people may look at GreenSock and kind of scratch their head and go, well, okay, cool. It's yet another animation library. And it seems like there's one, every few weeks that comes out. So they might greet that with a yawn. But then there are the guys and gals that are they really are the cutting edge of web technology and immersive interactions in websites. And so the things that Flash used to do are, the people that were doing those in Flash love our tool set. So, Lucas, it sounds like you were doing a lot of that kind of stuff. And so many of those people would come over and they would look at the technologies that were, like the CSS transitions and CSS animations and jQuery animate. And it was very frustrating for them. They felt like, their wings were clipped and they couldn't do what they used to be able to do to create all this amazing immersive interaction in the browser. And so that's really the audience that tends to love what GreenSock offers. But then, I don't want to make it sound like that's the only people that this appeals to, because we also, as part of what we're doing, is we try to solve real world problems that actual animators have, so there are browser inconsistencies. There are things like, if you're trying to animate SVGs and, transforms can be a major headache if you're trying to rotate something or, make it spin around its center or whatever. There are a bunch of tasks that you might think you could just use CSS animations to do, but then you run into the fact that, Firefox doesn't support that, or it's, I won't get into all the bugs, but there are a lot of them out there. And so with GreenSock, our goal was to make it just work. So you can tell it to animate whatever you want, and we handle all of that gobbledygook underneath to sense when we have to do some fancy footwork to just deliver the experience that you're asking for without all the headaches. So even if you're doing simpler stuff in the browser, it doesn't mean that GreenSock isn't for you, because we still do solve all those other problems. But kind of the sweet spot, the people that tend to love us the most are the ones that are the really highly building dynamic interactions in the browser.
What kinds of applications do those tend to be, Jack?
Applications, that's, I guess...
Or is it in websites? In other words, what kinds of things are people doing where they can really benefit from the kinds of animations and visualizations that you're talking about?
Well, there are, various awards sites where they, like the FWA awards and sites like that are geared towards finding just the coolest websites out there and, giving them awards. And so last several years, the site of the year, they've used GreenSock to do their stuff. But I don't want to paint this picture like it's only for people that are doing super high-end stuff with things flying all over the screen and WebGL and that kind of stuff. There are plenty of people that are building, apps that are, run on phones or games. We have some of the biggest gaming companies use GreenSock for their interfaces. So, gamers tend to really like GreenSock as well. So it's a tough question for me to answer because, I don't want to pigeonhole things too much. But again, the people that are really pushing things and they need a tool set that is very flexible and performant, those are the people that appreciate GreenSock the most.
So, Lucas, how have you been using GreenSock?
I was hoping you would ask that. So I have actually a few posts on my blog, onehungrymind.com, that actually leverages a GreenSock. So some various like photo album widgets and some full page slideshows and some different things. And where GreenSock is really, really handy is when you actually need to do dynamic animations based on the state of your application or the sequence or the type of interaction that a user has. So for instance, if you're going through a slideshow and you either are going to the previous slide or the next slide, you may want to animate that differently. So maybe from left to right or right to left or even up or down or vice versa. Well, using GreenSock, it's really easy to dynamically kind of calculate those variables and then set that animation on its merry way to do that. And so I think Angular did a really good job of how they set up animations and how that it actually works and that it just defers to however you want to do it. And so with that said, is I simply say, here's this event. Now GreenSock, go ahead and animate. And here's maybe some, variables that you'll need to do to actually calculate, for instance, like your starting point and your end point. And it's some really nice kind of you can do full blown like immersive web applications or websites like, we used to do in Flash. But even just having, a menu come in, really nice and clean and snappy from a certain way or whatever is really quite easy to do with GreenSock because you just kind of delegate and then you can calculate your animations on the fly and go from there.
So how does that intersect Angular? And do you tend to build these into your own custom directives that wrapper these, or do you just do it as needed in certain places? How does Angular and GreenSock come together?
So I'd like to chip in right here. I have a fairly limited exposure to GreenSock, and I know that the question was directed at Lucas, but as I kind of learned and figured out GreenSock versus just doing raw animations myself, what I sort of felt like was that GreenSock is basically jQuery for animations. And I don't know, Jack, if you have an opinion on that label.
In a way, it's flattering because, jQuery, everybody knows jQuery, and it's just kind of a go-to tool in many people's tool sets. So that's great. I like it in that sense. I always cringe a little bit just because jQuery's animate is, their animation capabilities are
right.
Less than stellar.
It's not just about the fact that everybody knows it. It's also the fact that the DOM has a terrible API. It has improved, but mostly it's the cross-browser stuff. Still, the raw DOM API is kind of rough. jQuery wraps this awesome, easy-to-learn API, and it was really, I would heartily argue with anybody who disagreed with me because I'm definitely right on every opinion that I have. But it was
always
it was jQuery that really enabled big web apps when people started doing JavaScript, realized that it sucked, and when frameworks like jQuery started coming out, people thought, hey, you actually can do cool things with JavaScript.
And the other thing I love about that is that jQuery shields you from a lot of the, the inner workings and the hassles, the day-to-day stuff, where you just say, here's what I want, and then, jQuery handles it, and it just works the way that you want it to work.
Like, oh my gosh, can I please rant about animations in the browser? Like, I would love for a nice description on what the difference is between a transformation and there's JavaScript-based animations, then transitions. Like, there's 4 different kinds of things, and it's not obviously what's what. And it's so nice to have a wrapper over that makes it so you don't have to understand all these detailed inner workings unless you need to dig down and do something. But, man, it is so nice to use the stuff when you see GreenSock after you've seen the raw JavaScript do the same thing. It's just great.
Well, so Jack, do you like if somebody you have sort of an abstraction over a particular animation, and do you look into the browser and say, it's this, so I guess I have to fall back to this kind of JavaScript thing, but I could use CSS here, or do you do that? You're making those kinds of decisions under the hood for me?
Sort of, but we don't make the decision to use JavaScript or CSS animations. There are no CSS transitions or animations in GreenSock whatsoever, because at their very core, they're quite limited in some ways that would prevent them from working in GreenSock. So, for example, we have the ability for you to build out timelines, and so people often are familiar with tweens, where you're saying, okay, here's the start state. I want to tween, the top from this value to that value. So that's a tween. But then what happens if you want to have a lot of those? So, tween the top, and then I want to move it over to the left, and then I want to change the color, and then I want this to happen. And maybe they all kind of overlap in some way, so they don't start at the same time, but they're kind of staggered. If you start building that stuff up, it gets quite cumbersome in other technologies. And GreenSock, we have a timeline that you can create, and you can even nest timelines within other timelines. So it creates this nice layer of abstraction, and it allows you to modularize your code, your animation code. So it's just so much easier to work with. And if we tried to do that with CSS transitions and animations under the hood, they don't allow you to have the kind of controls. For example, with GreenSock, you can jump to any point, and let's say you built out a 10-second banner type storytelling animation with all sorts of things happening. You can say, I want to jump to exactly 5.3 seconds into that, and it renders it exactly the way that it should be at 5.3 seconds. And that's not really possible to do, and to reverse things on the fly. So let's say you've got something that has already played 5.3 seconds, and then the user clicks a button and you want that to go backwards to where it came from. That's virtually impossible to do with CSS transitions and animations. So to answer your question, we do a lot of those kinds of decisions under the hood, but it's not whether or not to use CSS animations. It's more about, for example, if you're doing transforms, if you're rotating an SVG and it's in Internet Explorer, well, Internet Explorer does not recognize any kind of CSS properties, or transforms at least, on SVG elements. So we have to, instead of applying it on the CSS layer, there's a transform attribute for SVG elements. And so we'd apply it there. So that's the kind of stuff that we're doing under the hood that you don't have to worry about. You just say, rotate it to, 35 degrees, and it just works. But we're applying, if you looked under the hood in Chrome versus Internet Explorer, it might, you might see it applied to the CSS in one and applied to the transform in the other.
That's what you're talking about. Oh, yeah, it does. I mean, at the detail level, it's like, run away. I don't want to know. I've got other things I'm trying to do. I just wanted it to move. So I definitely hear what Joe is saying and what the value is there. Do people push back and say, yeah, but can you use the GPU? And what's the present and the future on that? Or is that one of those red herrings where people say that's what they want, but they don't really know what they're asking for?
No, I'm glad you brought that up. It's a great question. I think a lot of people wonder about that. It's a common misperception, actually. People assume that only the native, CSS transitions and animations can leverage the GPU, but that's not the case. In fact, we do that by default. If you animate the translation or the rotation or the scale using GreenSock, we automatically apply it on the 3D level. And when you do that, it will promote that element to its own GPU layer. And so that's a browser level thing. But the way that we apply the values tells the browser, hey, this thing should get its own GPU layer, so that then it performs much better, especially on mobile devices. So earlier you asked, why would somebody use GSAP in Angular? And that's one of the benefits, is that you just kind of automatically get the GPU promotion, the layer promotion, whenever you animate transforms with GSAP.
That's good news. Actually, my question was about the Angular intersection was somewhat different. I was trying to understand how, when you're writing an Angular app, you would say, and now is the moment in which I turn the wheel over to GreenSock, and I was wondering how that, where, as an Angular developer, where that takes place.
So I can answer that.
And that's what I was hoping somebody would do.
So let me answer that. With Angular, you have the ng-animate module, which then you get a convenience method on your actual module instance that is .animation. And from there, you will give your animation that you're defining a name. And so it's all CSS class-based. So if you're doing JavaScript or CSS, it'll still be this dot kind of class name notation. But from there, then you define essentially the event hooks that you want to animate on. So for instance, you might have an add class and a remove class, and then you can define an animation for each one of those events. So when a class gets added to an element, then ng-animate will pick that up. So essentially it's kind of a class-based directive and say, hey, this thing is fired. Here's your element that we're going to animate on. Here's the class name that was added, and then a done callback. And so from here, then using element, I can actually have access to the scope, doing element.scope and calling that scope paren. So you're calling the scope method to get that instance. And then from there, you can say, well, what is the state of the scope? So I might say, if I set a direction property on that scope, right or left or whatever, I can make some calculations. And then I can call, for instance, like tweenmax and say tweenmax.to, and then I'll pass in the element that was provided by ng-animate in the add class event. And I can say animate this element, let's say for like a half a second. And then here is my animation kind of configuration object. So I might say, go left by 500 pixels, and then on complete, execute this done callback to let Angular know that this animation has completed.
Okay, so if I were to try and boil that down, let me play it back to you. My gateway to this, my Angular gateway to this is ng-animate.
Mm-hmm.
And then I take advantage of some event hooks inside ng-animate to express my intention and then delegate that on to GreenSock components.
Yep. And so that is actually how animations work in Angular across the board. So I personally prefer GreenSock, and so most of my animations are in their JavaScript using GreenSock. But for instance, Matthias, who wrote ng-animate, he's more fond of CSS animations. And so he will simply, once the event is fired, then he'll defer it to something like animate.css. And so to summarize, animations in Angular using ng-animate is nothing more than a set of events that you can then hook into, and you defer the entire animation to whatever you want to use it. And so once that event has been fired, then it's like, hey, this thing happens, this method gets called, and within that, then you can, for instance, hook and do like tweenmax and say, animate this element and do these things, whether it's left or right, fade in, like a 3D transform, or whatever you can imagine, you can accomplish within that event handler.
Got it. Now, Jack, is that kind of approach how people do it when they're not using Angular? I mean, if they're using some other thing like, I don't know, React or something, it's that same pattern. You're looking for whatever their UI framework is to have an animation moment, a hook, and then they start invoking GreenSock, or is there some other way in which GreenSock is used more widely?
Well, GreenSock really, we try to take a hands-off approach on, you build your stuff however you want to build your stuff. And GreenSock is just kind of, it owns the animation layer there. So you can sprinkle it on top of really anything. So at its core, any animation is simply changing values, hopefully 60 times per second. And that's it. So it doesn't matter if it's the, CSS property top or left or, whatever. GreenSock doesn't have some predefined list of here are the allowable things you can animate. You just point it at an object and you tell it what property you want it to animate, and it will do it. So it can even be a custom JavaScript object with a custom named property. It could care less. And so if it's React, if it's Angular, if it's, right in the DOM, it doesn't really matter. So as far as where you put your logic for, React versus Angular versus some other options, GreenSock doesn't really care. You can write it however you want.
Got it. So let's suppose you're an animation noob and you're just afraid of this whole thing, because that pretty much describes me. Chuck, are you with me on this? And
yeah.
It's like okay, well, I mostly what I'm doing is I'm just taking this off the screen and putting that on the screen, and it looks jerky, and I wish it was better, but so I want to kind of get in, but I want to get into the water without drowning. What's my pathway?
It's a great question, and there are a lot of learning resources out there. I'd say probably the best place to start is just the Getting Started page on our website. And, that has a video right at the top. So you can sit there and watch the video, and it kind of outlines the basics of how to get up and running. And then, there's an ebook that just came out about GSAP. There's, there are classes you can go to. Peter Ticci is putting out a whole new course very soon. So there are a lot of resources out there. Sarah Drasner has been writing quite a bit about GreenSock. So hopefully it's not too terribly difficult to get up and running, but there is a little bit of a learning curve. But what we typically hear is that there's this moment at which, you spend a little bit of time with it, and then you're like, oh my gosh, the light bulb goes on, and it's like, oh, this all makes sense now. I don't know if Lucas, if you could speak to that much with your own experience, but we hear that relatively often because it's a little bit of a different mindset than somebody who's coming from a CSS animations or CSS transitions background, but which I assume you might be a little bit more familiar with. But once you get it, I'm
terrified of the whole friggin' mess. I just want to program, man, and I just wish I wish my thing looked better. And it's shameful to admit it, but I think I have company.
Yeah,
assist you, Ward.
For sure.
Yeah, I'm a total animation noob, so I'm with you there, Ward.
But I think that most of us can kind of reason about, I have this element, and I want it to start here, and I want it to end here. And in that sense, I have found the kind of the tween max, tween light APIs to be really easy. So for instance, you have a to method that you can say, I want to take this element and I want to move it here. And then you simply define the values for the properties you want to animate within this object, and you're good to go. Or you can even do to from, I believe, where you can say start here and then end here. And so when you start to look at your animations, it's purely, here's my starting data structure of these are properties and values that I want them to have or that they currently have. And then this is the data structure that I wanted to end up as. So for instance, saying property alpha equals 0 and then going alpha to 1, that's just simply just setting a property on a data structure which happens to represent something visually on the page. So for me, that's why I generally prefer programmatic animation over like CSS, stylistic animation and going in that avenue, because I do understand if I have a data structure with properties and I just change these properties to equal something else, then I get this transformation from kind of this point A to point B. And I think anybody who's ever written, any kind of software can understand that paradigm and then just apply it to something that has a visual representation within the page.
Yeah, I think I could manage that.
Yeah, it's like graphing in my mind anyway, I kind of see this graph where, I want its orientation or, its position or its, transparency or whatever, to change over time. And yeah, the way that the CSS does it has been somewhat counterintuitive to me. And so being able to basically set the interval and tell it to behave a specific way, that really kind of makes a lot more sense to me, from a programmer standpoint, because basically what I'm doing then is I'm telling it, this is the attribute I care about, and here's the formula for it.
Yeah, exactly. At its core, animation is really just, a thing with its properties, and you want to change it over time. So you give it a duration and the end values, and you let it rip. And if you want to customize that, you can change the easing, so the style at which it moves. So if you want it to kind of ease out or ease in, or there's elastic things, so if which can be really nice if you're making something move from one place to another and it kind of wiggles back and forth at the final duration or the final
cubic zirconium.
Yeah,
I love that tweeting equation.
I just call it cubic zirconium because I don't know what the heck they're talking about, but it makes me sound smart. And I can get that on the QVC network. So, all right, I have a fun question for you, which is give me some of your favorite animation atrocities.
Atrocities. Oh,
yeah, the
gosh.
things, the equivalent of the blink tag.
It's painful. Yeah. I mean, I think we've all seen things like that where you show up at a website and, one of my pet peeves is just when things take way too long. And I don't mean loading time. I mean, it's kind of like if you give an artist a set of paints, they'll create a masterpiece. If you give that same set of paints to, a 4-year-old, you're going to get something very different. And so sometimes people will go a little nuts with, colors and painting, and they'll go a little nuts with animations where, hey, I really love this thing spinning, so I'll make it spin for 4 seconds before it finally comes to a stop.
Right.
And I can actually get to do what I'm trying to do. I came to this website to do something, and it's like when animations get in the way, that drives me nuts. They should be there to help you, move the experience forward and, make it more intuitive and not get in your way. But I see animations get in the way all the time.
Yeah, they were really cool, like when you first looked at them, but after you've seen it 6 times, I've had enough already. I just would like to get there.
Exactly. Yeah. And by the way, that reminds me of something that, workflow-wise, I don't think gets enough attention. And, which is if you're building an animation that takes a little while, and, Lucas, maybe you've done this, I'm not sure. Many others have, but if you're doing, let's say you've got a 10-second animation and you're building that out, and let's make it even worse. Let's say it's a 60-second animation, and you've tweaked it all the way up until that last. You're finishing that final 10 seconds, and then you have to go back. You tweak some code, and then you go back to the browser and you refresh, and you have to sit there through the first 50 seconds, which you've already looked at 100 times before. And, just so that you can get to that final 10 seconds to see, do I need to tweak the timing a little bit or the easing? And, with GreenSock, it's super easy to just add one little line of code to say, jump to, 50 seconds into this animation, so that every time you refresh the page, that's all you have to see. And it makes producing those animations a heck of a lot easier, for you when you're building them. And then you just remove that line of code when you're done, and then let it rip, and you're done.
Actually, I could imagine that as being useful within, in a production environment where you needed sort of a slow move in the beginning, but just to get the user oriented. But then you could crisp things up from that point forward because they already, had that mental transition, and now they don't need that animation to go on, or some other set of animations to go on so long. And I imagine you could tweak that on the fly, yeah?
Yeah, for sure. And there's a time scale thing that you can apply to any tween, any timeline, really anything in GreenSock, so that you can, let's say you built out this animation, you can just say, I want that thing to play at twice the normal speed, or half the normal speed, or whatever you want. And you can even do a global time scale, which can be quite useful if, for example, we got a question in the forums the other day from somebody who said, I want my IE 8 users to not really see animations. I want things to just happen immediately because that browser is so terrible. And, for whatever reason, they just want it to make the animation go away. And if you set the time scale to a crazy high amount, that's really all you have to do. That's like one line of code. You could sense if it's IE8 and then say, I want the timescale to be 100. So that then you don't really have to change any of your other code. It just makes things look almost instantaneous, and vice versa. If you're tweaking things and you want to really zoom in on something in particular and you want it to run at, a tenth of the speed, again, just during production, that's super easy to do. And I think animation is one of those things where it's very experimental. You have to kind of play with it. You never know what feel, is it going to be a 0.5 second tween or a 0.3 second tween? And those things, it might sound silly, but in the hands of an animator, that's a huge, huge deal. And to be able to kind of play with it and watch it and say, no, you know what, that's a little too fast or that's a little too slow. I need a different ease on that. Experimenting is so critical. So we try to make the tools so that it's easy to do that.
I'm wondering, you mentioned that animations can help move the experience forward. And some of the things seem somewhat obvious to me, have something slide in or slide out. But are there other areas of your application that you should be looking at, or things that may trigger you to think, oh yeah, I definitely need to be adding an animation here, or I should at least be thinking about adding an animation to this part of my application?
I would say that, gosh, there's probably a list of them. And this isn't necessarily my area of expertise, but I would say intuitively, things where you need to draw attention or when you're changing state somehow to give the user a little clue about that. So sliding something over to the next screen, or if there's an error, let's say they clicked the submit button and there's some kind of an error, if you animate the change of the button color, or it wiggles a little bit, or something like that. If there's, you can sense, put a timer on things so that if somebody's taking a really long time and you're wanting to move them forward in the process, maybe the submit button will give a little wiggle once in a while, just to kind of cue the user that, hey, this thing over here is where you should be looking next. I think can be a nice effect that helps move things forward instead of just being animation for the sake of animation and impressing everybody.
Will it add glitter for Ward?
I'm working on that. That's a new plugin.
Okay.
So no animation is complete unless you have audio and the animations in there too, and that's what Ward really wants.
Yeah, there you go.
You guys are terrible.
If I could jump in here real quick, sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
I don't mean to bond here, but I think it's really important to call this out. Is in the Flash world, and you still have this in JavaScript. You've got these full page immersive websites, and I think those are amazing. And when they're done right, I think it's a great investment for somebody to go and produce those things, and they're really great. But where animations are also really important is in the scope of micro interactions. And, so it's like Jack said, that when you are giving subtle cues to the user, then doing that in a way that I think kind of conveys personality. So, you're showing them an air and not just having it like just show up, but actually kind of fade in a little bit, it will affect how actually a person responds to that. And a good friend of mine, Shane Melke, who I've had the privilege of working on a lot of kind of award-winning sites over the last, I think, probably 10 years, is when he approaches animations is he tries to imagine the animation having a personality. And so when you're having a conversation essentially with an application, is how would that application, if it were a person, respond to the user? And so it's not going to say, hey, you did this thing wrong, and kind of scream at it.
Lots of red. But when you can actually use animations to kind of convey this in a way that is almost in a conversational tone, like something fades in, very nice and pleasant. It's like, hey, you forgot this thing, or it's this cue here, or even when you type something in and something's just updating in real time, but it's animating as you go along and kind of guiding the user along this experience. Is it almost you're giving your application a personality. And micro interactions are very, very important to really nailing down, especially on an application level. And it's an opportunity to, one, increase the user experience, but when things appear to work better in their minds, in the user's mind, it simply does. And so there's a whole, UX kind of discussion on that. But micro actions is a massive opportunity to start applying animations and increase the experience for your users.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
Anyways, Ward, you were saying, carry on, my friend.
I was thinking about that bit about moving things on, and one of the things that we all hate are you press save and then up comes an alert box that says, did you mean to save? And it's like, yeah, of course, that's why I pressed the save button. And so we've tried to get rid of some of these modals, and now we go to auto-saving, and now we've gone so much to moving them that we don't really have that kind of comforting confirmation that something good happened, like it actually did autosave, or it did do something in the background that I'd like to know. I don't want you to interrupt my flow. And so I can imagine, I was just thinking when Jack was talking about the subtle kinds of animation opportunities there, and I think that ties in what you're talking about, Lucas, also, that sort of micro interaction thing where it's just, you're getting that nudge that over time makes you feel like things are good, and then if things aren't good, then you'll notice that they're missing and you'll wonder why, and then you'll go find out why, that kind of thing. It sounds pretty subtle, and I'd love to have a bag of these tricks around that I could know about and use. Are those around?
Ward, if I could interrupt just a quick sec, I think what you're kind of getting at is similar to what I was going to ask, and that's a lot of times people don't really know what animations to use when and where to help the workflow.
That's it, John. So why didn't you just say that the first time?
That's good. They don't know what they don't know. And is there anything besides a list of, here's the entrance animation, the zoom animation, the bounce animation? I mean, is there any kind of like recommendations of here's how you can make your workflow easier if you use this in this situation and so on and so forth?
That sounds a lot like the, Google's attempt at the material design, which is like an animation language of sorts, visual language where, and I think that's a great idea to have that in your projects where it's like, here's the style we're going for. Here's the personality of our app. And how does that affect, our submit buttons? How does that affect, when modal windows pop up or don't pop up or, alerts? How should we handle that? How should things animate in? And it would be critical to have that be very consistent across the board in your animation or in your application. So as far as there being things you can just sprinkle in, we don't necessarily have things like that are pre-baked, but I have heard of other things out there. In fact, I believe on this podcast there was mention of a library out there. Lucas, I think it was you who mentioned it at one point, where there's some kind of canned effects that leverage GSAP.
That's NGFX by my BFF, Scott Moss.
There you go.
And I will paste the link in here, and we'll put this in the podcast notes.
So you mentioned material design, which I think is interesting. And just to be clear, there's material design, and then there's also angular material design. Material design, as I understand it, is basically a set of guidelines and principles on how to do these kind of animations. Do I have that correct?
I think so. I'm no expert on that, so I don't want to act like I am, but that's, I think that's my understanding as well. Yes.
Yeah, and I'm kind of looking at the site, and it's more the design side of things. What does motion mean? What does bold and graphic mean? Kind of how that all works. I think that's interesting, and just to throw another side of that is Angular material design, as I understand it, is basically an implementation of material design for Angular. Where does that fit in with kind of what you guys are doing with GreenSock?
Well, I would say that GreenSock is an engine that could drive the actual implementation of whatever you decide your animations should look like. So at some point, you might say, well, our button should animate to be green when this happens and then wiggle when that happens and then, whatever. Or we want this transition to happen in between states. Well, at that point, you have to build that. And is it going to be CSS animations, CSS transitions? Are you going to use GSAP? As what are you going to use to do it? And GreenSock would be a tool that you could use to make those things happen in the browser.
So my last question for you is then, if somebody on a team is looking at building an application and wants to use animations properly, where would you point them? Would you point them at material design with, assuming it's Angular, material design with Angular, at GreenSock? Is there a website? What's kind of the one-stop shop that you would send people to first?
Well, it depends on what you mean by done properly. Because, I'm more of a technician and my brain immediately goes to properly implemented so that it works across the board in all browsers. But when, some people might mean done properly in the sense that, design-wise, it makes sense.
Yeah, and I kind of mean both. I mean performance-wise and user experience design-wise.
Yeah. I don't know of, nothing's coming to the top of my head right now for a, go-to resource for that type of thing. Does anybody else on the show have an idea?
Mm. No, that's why I asked. I was hoping you knew.
I wish it was out there. I'm not aware of anything exactly like that.
That's called opportunity right there.
Yeah.
Because I think that's what a lot of people lack is I think they focus on one or the other. Like I have teams that work on creative design and they build the right design, but then actually implementing that sometimes is difficult. And then I've got teams who do the technical implementation of the animations, and sometimes that's not the design that the creative teams want. So marrying those two together is often more difficult than I have hoped it would be.
Yep, I hear you. Need to find that unicorn out there that's the hybrid of the perfect designer and just got the technical chops to do all the stuff.
The green unicorn. There you go, GreenSock unicorns.
Right. That's right. So I'm a little curious. I've been poking around your website, and there's this no-charge GreenSock license.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to talk a little bit about licensing?
Sure. Yeah, so this is something that we're going to be writing about soon. So there's the no-charge license, which is, one of the goals of the project was to have it be very accessible. So we don't want to erect these barriers so that, many people think of in terms of, am I using this for personal use or commercial use? Because many licenses out there will allow you to do it for free if it's only for personal use. But then as soon as you make any money off of it, then you have to get the commercial license. And that's not how GreenSock works. The no charge license applies to even commercial projects that are charged, where you charge one company or individual. So let's say that, Nike hires you to build the next Nike.com and they pay you some crazy sum of money. You get $1 million for building this website and you use GreenSock all over the place. That's fine. That the no charge license applies there. But we also, like I said earlier, we wanted to have some kind of funding mechanism that would protect it from the vulnerabilities of open source, of many open source projects. And so we did that by having a commercial license for a very particular type of use where you're using it and you're charging end users, multiple end users, for the use of your app or game or site or whatever. So think about a game in the App Store. That would be something that you need the commercial license for. And that is, we tie that in with our Club GreenSock. So if, there's 3 different levels, there's Simply Green, Shockingly Green, and Business Green. And, obviously different prices, but the Business Green one comes with not only a bunch of extra plugins that allow you to do some fancy stuff, but also the commercial license, so that you can use it in those games and apps that you're charging multiple end users for. Cool.
So the other question I have, and this harks way back, but you brought it up again. You mentioned mobile apps. So can you use GreenSock in like Ionic or other hybrid mobile apps?
Anything that JavaScript is involved with, you can use GreenSock. So I know that there are plenty of people that use it in apps that are kind of compiled down, like Cordova, or I know there are other ones out there that will ultimately spit out a native application, and they use GreenSock in that. So as long as JavaScript lives there, GreenSock should be able to be just fine.
All right. Well, unless there's anything else, we'll go ahead and get to the picks. John, do you want to start us off with picks?
Sure. I have a completely non-technical pick because I just got back from a 2-week vacation where I never touched my laptop. And my pick is, man, you all should do that at some point. Take a vacation, go with your family, put down the computers. Don't think about Angular, Adventures in Angular, GreenSock, or Ward Bell's outfits. Just take your time and chill out.
What are you talking about?
I'm so refreshed at this point. It's the best thing I've done all year. So definitely take a vacation and actually do the vacation. Wonderful.
All right. Lucas, do you have some picks for us?
So I have 2 picks. The first one is going to seem a bit obvious, but it's GreenSock Animation Platform. I love it. I'm a huge fan. I've written about it a ton. I've shot videos. GreenSock.com. If you haven't tried it, give it a spin. Literally. My second pick is the book Micro Interactions by Dan Safer, I believe is how you pronounce it. And it's a really, really great book about micro interactions, and it's full color and very informative about how you can start to integrate these kind of feedback mechanisms into your application.
Very cool. Joe, do you have some picks for us?
You bet. My first pick is a book. It's called Beautiful Outlaw. And the book is about Christ. And it's a book about the fact that he had a personality and analyzing what that personality was like and talking about that through scriptural evidence. So if you happen to be interested in that subject, I found it to be very interesting and presenting him as a more approachable figure rather than some very distant, unknowable, incomprehensible thing. So I really enjoyed that book. I'm in the middle of reading it. I've greatly enjoyed what I've read so far. My other pick is going to be GOG.com. I'm not really sure what it stands for, if it stands for anything. Anyway, it's a website.
Good old games.
Good old games. Thank you. I recently picked up a couple of games that I just absolutely loved from decades past. Star Wars Rebellion, one of my favorite real-time strategy games of all time, and Wasteland 1, which is way, way back. And I was playing that just because Wasteland 2 came out recently, and I was thinking about it, and I wanted to play it. And it's just great because you can play those really old games on a modern computer, and they're super cheap. So GOG.com, that's my other pick.
All right, Ward, you have some picks for us?
Well, I didn't get ready with those because, as John suggested, I took a micro vacation, which means that I just ran in the door after coming off the mountain, trying out a hammock, sleeping in a hammock. So, hey, maybe that's my pick. If you're an outdoorsy type and you haven't slept in a hammock, check it out.
Awesome. I've got a couple of picks myself. I think I mentioned at the top of the show the remoteconfs.com. So if you want to get talks from the remote conferences, you want them in an RSS feed, go check it out, remoteconfs.com. It's funny that Joe picked what he picked because I was going to pick God because I feel that he's pretty involved in my life and I have to give him a lot of credit for what I feel like I've been able to accomplish. And I think he's pretty awesome. He sent his son, Jesus Christ, and I'm going to pick Jesus as well. If you want to find out more about what my beliefs are and about the church that I belong to, you can go to lds.org and check it all out. You can also get more information. You can have the missionaries come visit you. You can get a Book of Mormon there for free, all kinds of good stuff. So anyway, go check that out. Jack, what are your picks?
Well, it's tough to follow. I'm a huge Christ fan myself. So my picks, I guess I'll make Jesus my number one pick. But what I have written down here was CodePen. Actually, we use CodePen all the time. Chris Coyer is involved in that, and his team is awesome. And in the forums, we just use them constantly. So it's a great tool. Love it. Try it out if you haven't. And then the second one that I had here is Seth Godin. Pretty much anything he writes, I just find pretty inspiring. And he talks about getting your art out there into the world and not obsessing about it being perfect. And a lot of people hide behind the fact that, hey, this thing isn't perfectly polished and there will be some haters out there. And so I want to protect myself from being hated. And, it just kind of pushes you. He's got a daily blog, and I find myself consistently challenged and inspired, where he's like, you know what, your art is not going to be for everybody. And that's okay. Don't use that as an excuse and put it out there anyway because the world needs it.
I totally want to second that pick. Seth's awesome.
Yeah, I love his stuff. All right, well, if people want to find out more about you or about GreenSock or animations or anything like that, where should they go? What should they do?
Just check out greensock.com and, Twitter or at GreenSock. And, there's tons of resources that are linked on our site there. So just greensock.com.
Awesome. All right. Well, I think we're done. So thank you for coming.
I appreciate it, guys. It's been an honor.
Hooray!
This episode is sponsored by Mad Glory. You've been building software for a long time, and sometimes it gets a little overwhelming. Work piles up, hiring sucks, and it's hard to get projects out the door. Check out Mad Glory. They're a small shop with experience shipping big products. They're smart, dedicated, will augment your team, and work as hard as you do. Find them online at madglory.com or on Twitter at madglory. Hosting and bandwidth provided by the Blue Box Group. Check them out at bluebox.net. Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CacheFly.com to learn more. Would you like to join the conversation with the iPhreaks and their guests? Want to support the show? We have a form that allows you to join the conversation and support the show at the same time. You can sign up at iPhreakshow.com/form.